to help us plan a more livable city. To help us plan a more livable city. To gather, analyse data to make smart decisions about how we might respond to challenges facing our city. With the frequency of extreme heat events in urban environments, heat stress is becoming a major health concern for pedestrians navigating their way across the urban landscape. Sensors across the city measure localised information, including air quality, precipitation and humidity, shadows and shaded areas, and temperature throughout the day. We can draw on this data to inform planning of future cooling infrastructure where it is needed, and provide information on the coolest parts of the city to travel, so you can find the coolest route and move comfortably through the city any time of day.
We have to get a sense of reality.
What climate change is doing is attacking the basics of human existence.
At the turn of the century, there began to be recognition that there was a nexus between what's happening in climate change and national security.
We have no strategic leadership in a security sense on climate change.
We're seeing the profound impact of climate change right now.
The whole concept of a nation state may actually start disappearing.
Where will people go when they're dying of thirst?
This is a humanitarian crisis.
We cannot mess around with the future of civilization.
Investing in fossil fuels is like handing an AK-47 to your most sworn enemy. Why would you do that?
Hello and welcome to the second event of the Reset 21 Forum series. The aim of this series is to have some critical conversations that we hope will move us forward and help us respond better to the climate emergency. This event also builds on the momentum of last year's National Climate Emergency Summit. And the aim of this is really, we're hoping to reset the ambition to tackle climate change. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the people of the Woiwurrung and the Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations, on whose unceded lands I'm coming to you from tonight. And I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that you're on and acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. Now, hi, I'm Jo Lauder. I'm a broadcaster with the ABC and a reporter on Hack on Triple J Radio. Now, the theme tonight of our talk is Pandemonium. So we're in a pandemic. It's only fitting that there have been some last minute changes. Also, we apologise for coming to you a few minutes late. There's been some changes to how we're running tonight because of restrictions in Melbourne, just out of an abundance of caution. I'm welcoming everyone tonight from a live stream, and we've also got our amazing guests live streaming on Zoom for you tonight. And we're coming to you, as you can probably tell in a few shots, from the Capitol Theatre. This is a carbon neutral theatre. We'd also like to thank our major partners, the City of Melbourne, RMIT University, the Breakthrough National Centre for Climate Restoration and the Safe Climate Fund. Tonight's event is also part of the National Sustainable Living Foundation Festival, and it's going to be on all through February. Now, before we get started, we're going to be taking, as I said, we don't have an audience here tonight. You're all joining us on the live stream. So we're going to be taking your questions on slido.com, which is SLIDO.com. And you can submit questions using the hashtag Reset21. Also, if you like someone else's questions, you feel free to please upvote them as well, and we'll get to them later on in the conversation. Now, if the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us anything, it's really demonstrated our capacity as a collective to respond to an emergency on a global scale, and an existential emergency at that. Throughout the pandemic, we've seen governments at all levels across the whole political spectrum show us that they can work in a bipartisan manner, mostly, to deliver action that's averted the worst case scenario. And this has saved lives. And look, it's not just about the politicians either. This is individuals, businesses, and communities that have come together for a common cause and shown that we can face this emergency. The world recognised the pandemic as an emergency, treated it like that, and acted accordingly. Now, it's safe to say that that has not been how we've responded to climate change up until this point. For years in Australia and around the world, the politics of climate change has been entrenched, and it's stopped us making enough progress, and we're not where we need to be. As well as totally upheaving our lives, here in Australia especially, it felt like the pandemic slowed some of the momentum that we had towards climate change action. But there are lessons here in the pandemic. It's shown us really what is possible. And it's also shown us that we can mobilise in a way that I think we would have all thought was completely impossible only a year ago when we were last here talking with the Climate Emergency Summit. So tonight we want to dive into some of these questions, and we're going to be asking, what have we learned over the past year? What elements of this response can we then activate towards acting on climate change? What can we be doing? And also, what are the mistakes that have been made in the past year that we can avoid making a second time round when we're dealing with climate change? Now, the way things are going to run tonight is each of our guests have a presentation for you, and they're going to talk about what they believe are some of the major takeaways of the last 12 months and how that can be applied to the climate emergency. Our first speaker tonight is Stephen Duckett. He's the Director of the Health Program at the Grattan Institute, and his policy proposal, Go for Zero, how Australia can get to zero COVID-19 cases, formed the basis of Victoria's coronavirus response. Stephen is an Emeritus Professor of Health Policy at La Trobe University. He's held top leadership positions in healthcare in Australia and in Canada, including as Secretary of what is now the Commonwealth Department of Health and Ageing. Can we please welcome, with our, virtual applause or whatever, can we please welcome Stephen Duckett?
Thanks very much. And I'm coming to you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also, it would have been good to have been in the Capitol Theatre today, which is part of the RMIT University, because I'm a council member of RMIT, and we were pleased to create this carbon neutral venue. RMIT is going to be completely carbon neutral by 2030. I'd like to start by sharing my screen, and hopefully you can see my presentation now. We produced a couple of reports about COVID, and I'm going to briefly talk about some of the lessons from COVID. We also produced a report late last year on climate change and health, which identified a number of issues. Obviously, climate change impacts directly on health in a number of ways, and the health sector is one of the few sectors where you cannot achieve your health objectives without addressing climate change. It is absolutely intrinsic to the future of the healthcare system. Australia managed climate change, managed COVID quite well. We had 700 cases in Victoria earlier this middle of last year. Essentially zero, although it bounces around a bit depending on how we survive quarantine. The COVID, obviously there was an impact on the economy, but we've essentially bounced back quite well. Now, I'm going to talk, as I said, I'm going to talk about the impact of COVID and how we actually managed it. The first thing to remember is that the consumers responded to COVID ahead of government. So the consumers restricted their walking around, restricted their engagement with the community ahead of the government restrictions. That as a result of that, government had a social licence to act. they made it easier for them to impose for government, including mask wearing, restricting us from our exercise to 1 hour a day, and so on. And throughout this, public support was quite good. So you can see that in New South Wales, quite different states politically and in every sort of way you might mention, the government support didn't drop below 60% over this whole period. On the other hand, Victorian popularity or government support did in fact drop slightly under 50%, but it's gone back over 50% now. So despite the significant restrictions, despite the changes we had to make to the way we lived, the way we worked, state governments were supported throughout that. The other interesting thing about COVID is that the political spectrum in Australia was quite limited. We had very few COVID deniers in Australia. This is in stark contrast to the United States, where the then President Trump, was a COVID denier. You had extensive people who denied the existence of COVID. In Australia, we've got some who are COVID deniers, some fringe politicians, including Craig Kelly, who are COVID deniers. By and large, the not include COVID deniers, and by and large, the spectrum was the politicians accepted that COVID was an important issue. Most of the states, the exception being New South Wales and the Commonwealth Government, pursued a zero strategy, and so most of the states were pursuing the same sort of strategy during this period. Importantly, the different strategies, the people pursuing the different strategies, both emphasised the importance of evidence, both emphasised the importance of following the science. There was some difference between the suppression and elimination folk about what the evidence actually said, for example, about schools, but by and large, both agreed that evidence and science was important. And this is just a summary of the evidence. Basically, it says, masks are good, outdoors is less of a risk than indoors, poorly ventilated is more of a risk than unpoorly ventilated. So what worked? We had border controls, border closures, telehealth, masks, free testing from the start. What really was important was the clarity of the objective. So in Victoria, for example, the government, as it came out of COVID, said, we are aiming for zero. We are these are the criteria for what we're going to do when, and the staging for the reduction of restrictions and so on. So really clarity of the objective. What didn't work? Well, obviously the hotel quarantine failures. We live in a multicultural society, and so if you're a Melbourne person, you'll realise that we didn't handle the outbreaks in the public housing estates very well. Commonwealth state cooperation was variable. At the start, the Prime Minister, in an attempt to pretend he had some sort of involvement in all of this, created a national cabinet, but that pretty quickly collapsed, and so on. So I just want to finish by, again, talking about what worked and what happened in COVID, and get you to think about the relevance of this for climate change. So when I'm talking about COVID, you listen about climate change. The consumer response was ahead of government. The consumers basically accepted the importance of COVID/climate change, and they were responding ahead of government. This, in the case of COVID, and I suspect also in the case of climate change, created a social licence to act. The political spectrum in COVID was limited. That is not the case in climate change. There are many more deniers in climate change than there were in COVID. There's some overlap, of course. And basically, you've got a situation with respect to climate change where there is actually national agreement on what should happen, whether it's the right agreement or not. basically all the states have signed up to to be carbon neutral by 2050, whereas the Commonwealth can't sign up to know what day it is. And in the case of COVID, the evidence was accepted and understood, but there were different interpretations, whereas in the case of climate change, certainly the Commonwealth government is not able to reach agreement on what the evidence says. So there are some, I was asked to talk about the parallels. There are some significant parallels. Obviously, there are also significant issues with respect to climate change. We need to have public health system mobilised to address it, and that's what we've recommended in our report, and the same thing happened with COVID. So there's lots of issues which are common, but I think the political issues are significant, and some of them are on the side of climate change action, and some are not. Thank you very much.
Stephen. And next up, I'm really excited to introduce you to Sisonke Msimang. Sisonke is a South African writer whose work focuses on race, gender, and democracy. She's written for a range of international publications like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian. There are actually a whole range of really esteemed publications, but I cut it down to those ones just to save me some time. Sisonke has also held fellowships at Yale University, the Aspen Institute, and the University of Witwatersrand. Sisonke is also an author. She's written a book called Always Another Country, a memoir of exile and home, and the resurrection of Winnie Mandela. Sisonke, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. So I was asked, sorry, firstly, let me just say that I am joining you from Western Australia, and I join you from the land of the Noongar people. It's good to be on Buja, and of course, pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and those yet to emerge. So I was asked to speak to the politics of denial, and really base my comments on a piece I wrote for The Guardian about a year ago. Can everybody hear me? Okay, sorry, I'm getting distracted by the technician. So I wrote a piece for The Guardian about a year ago in which I reflected on my experiences as an activist in South Africa around HIV. And so I really want to talk about the sort of latter points that were just touched upon now, about the kind of politics of denial and what that means in the context of COVID, but more importantly, what it might mean for us as we think about a political and activist response to climate change and the climate emergency. So I spent most of my life working in social justice movements, first HIV and then gender-based violence, work around anti-racism. I lived in the US right after 9/11, and so I was involved in anti-war protests there. And I think, as any activist will tell you, denial is a really significant part of what you have to combat when you are in an activist movement. So it's kind of par for the course. So our opponents typically like to deny the science. They typically like to, for example, deny all manner of things because what they want to do is a strategy of minimization, right? So I grew up in exile from South Africa. So in many ways born into the anti-apartheid movement. So what apartheid, bureaucrats wanted to do was deny that segregation caused any harm. What AIDS deniers want to do is they want to say that the virus HIV doesn't cause AIDS, that in fact poverty is the reason why people are sick and dying. I've been very involved in movements to end gender-based violence, and there misogynists deny that women are killed because they're women. They say that they're subject to violence in similar ways that men are subject to violence. So the idea of denial, I think, is an important thing if you're thinking about activism, regardless of the issue. But of course, I think in recent times that specter of denial has become particularly problematic, and it's something that requires particular attention. In fact, I would say, of course, that denial of late has become an ideological tool. In the past, denial has been used to prevent action. I think now deniers are using it as a tool to develop very active and aggressive new agendas that converge in a range of ways. So we see the emergence of QAnon as a worldview that is increasingly mobilizing a whole range of foot soldiers whose doubts coalesce in ways that are particularly violent on the one hand, because we know that lots of conspiracy theorists coalesce around these ideas that are on the far right about a world order that are extremely anti-Semitic, that are extremely racist against Black people, et cetera, et cetera. So on the one hand, you have that, and that merges with this whole anti-vaxxer, you can't trust science, which of course now merges with an already existent group of people who don't believe that the Earth is in fact warming. So that convergence, I think, is particularly dangerous and has been given impetus by what we've seen happening in the United States. And of course, if you look at the news and what's been on the news, in the last 24 hours here in Australia with Craig Kelly, that notion that you can question the science because it's freedom of speech is I think gaining an ascendancy. And I think it has very real implications for those of us who believe in fighting for climate justice. So a really very quick kind of case study about South Africa. And so I'm not going to look at the past year. I'm going to go back 20 years and to talk to you a little bit about what happened in my country in the 1990s, mid 1990s, when our then president began to deny the reality of HIV, which we could see AIDS was killing so many people around us, and what that meant in terms of strategy and tactics for us to be able to address it and to get the government to sign up to a policy that was able to provide antiretroviral therapy and a really strong prevention campaign. So for those of you who don't know, in 1994, South Africa had its first democratically elected government. Nelson Mandela was our president. He stepped down in 1999, and his successor was Thabo Mbeki, widely respected, known as a very erudite man who was knowledgeable on a whole range of issues. He was not so knowledgeable, it turns out, on public health. We were in the grips of a very significant AIDS epidemic. It was obviously a global pandemic, and South Africa was at the epicenter. So my generation had, of course, inherited freedom. Many of our parents had fought for freedom. And for us, the trick was going to be, how do we manage this new country? What we didn't anticipate would be that we would have a president who denied the very reality that we could see in front of us, which is that many of our peers were dying. The initial concerns that Mbeki raised about HIV were along the lines of the statistics. So he insisted the statistics were being inflated. And so, there seemed to be a benign level of ignorance that was involved in those questions. And so I think activists followed his line of questioning and very quickly provided data to indicate that the statistics were in fact correct, that there were good data monitoring, that clinics were in fact testing, and that those test results were scientifically reliable, et cetera, et cetera. And what you will see with denial is that if the questions shift, because the intention remains the same. And so the questions shifted and began to be about whether or not there was in fact a link between the HIV virus and the syndrome called AIDS. So is there a real scientific link? Does this virus cause this set of things to happen to your body? And of course, the answer is very clearly yes. But what happened was the entire nation got distracted by this fake scientific question, which then meant that we could not deal with a very clear policy prescription, which was to distribute as many condoms as possible to as many people as possible, which was to begin to roll out a program of antiretroviral therapy to prevent mothers from infecting their babies when they were born. The science was very clear on that, which meant that many people who were in hospice and needed palliative care could not be cared for because we could not acknowledge that they were in fact dying of AIDS. There's a whole cluster of problems then emerges because the person who was at the helm of government was a denier. What activists, did very quickly, as soon as we realized that what we were engaged in was actually an ideological and political battle rather than a battle over science, was to move to a set of tactics that really involved humiliation, shame, and publicly calling out the president. This reached its sort of peak in the year 2000, when South Africa was hosting a very large international conference. The International AIDS Conference was in Durban. We were the host country, and we used that opportunity to really turn the spotlight onto our president and to get our colleagues from around the world who were from the scientific community, who are widely respected, to ask a series of questions. This was carried on the BBC and on CNN. And it had some shaming effect, but we weren't entirely successful. And then we took the battle to the streets. We had, similarly to what you've seen with young people with the climate strikes, we had marches and rallies and die-ins. We began to import drugs into the country illegally, and that is to say, to demand to be arrested when we came into the country, stood at the airport and said, "I am carrying antiretrovirals, arrest me," to highlight the issue. And what this began to do was it really put the public on notice, and it began to build sympathy, that the activists got the public on side. Many people had relatives dying, just as in Australia, many people have experienced the bushfires and have seen what it means for climate to be warming and what that means in very real and stark terms. And so that shifted the conversation, and so much pressure was brought upon the South African government that in 2004, in addition to a number of court cases, all of which were accompanied by singing and dancing, activists, we wore ourselves out in those events. All of this culminated in the government adopting an incredibly comprehensive program, which resulted in antiretrovirals being rolled out in all of our major hospitals for free. South Africa now has the largest AIDS program in the world. And in many ways, part of the reason you see a South African variant today in terms of COVID is because we really developed our capacity around research into vaccines and immune therapies on the basis of significant investments that activists pushed for. I'll stop there, but please feel free to ask me any questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sasonke. It's so amazing to hear about that kind of activism. I think it's really inspiring for lots of people. I've got heaps of questions, but also if you've got questions, it's at slido.com and you can put in your questions there, and we're going to come back, and we've definitely got some questions for Sasonke. Now, next up, we've got Philip Sutton. Philip is a manager and strategist at Transition Initiation, and it's a not-for-profit working towards the urgent transition for climate change. Philip was the architect of the Victorian Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act. He initiated the campaign that actually led to the banning of nuclear power in Victoria back in 1983. And he also authored a book in 2008 called Climate Code Red. It was a groundbreaking book, and back then it called for emergency action on climate change. Philip, thank you so much for coming on and having a chat to us.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
That's great. Good. I wanted to pick up from a point that Stephen Duckett made about the importance of having a clear objective as to why one is engaging in an emergency activity in the case of climate or COVID or AIDS, etc. And the other thing is that also, because I'm a bit inclined to expand what I say on the subject, I've actually written a speech to keep me sort of on track. So what I wanted to do was to, in fact, not just talk about the last 12 months. What I want to do is, in fact, give a fairly long historical perspective so that you can actually see that I think that there's a strong argument that the climate movement has lost its focus on an appropriate objective, and it's therefore currently rudderless, and that's a major problem. So 12 months ago, many of us met at the Melbourne Town Hall for the National Climate Emergency Summit. And at the time, the best analogues for the kind of activity that you might need to undertake to tackle an economy-changing emergency were the experiences of the World War II and World War One. But the problem was that very few people are old enough to have had any first-hand experience of those terrible events, and few people read history books. So the analogy itself was not terribly accessible to most people. What we didn't know when we met 12 months ago was that in the next 12 months, everybody in the world would gain first-hand experience of a huge economy-changing emergency, the COVID panic, of course, pandemic. And so that's now created a possibility of a much richer dialogue around this issue. What I'd like to do tonight is to focus on one key aspect of emergency management, and that's the issue of the focus of protection, and see what we can learn from past experiences and the current COVID emergency so that we can improve the effectiveness of what we're doing on climate. My interest in the focus on protection began in 1984, which is obviously quite a while ago. I had just been given a job to design a new piece of legislation for the state of Victoria, which is the Victorian Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act. I mean, with a name like that, it was pretty obvious that the purpose of it was to protect flora and fauna. But the question emerged pretty quickly as I sat down to try and work out how you'd actually draft this legislation is, what would it specifically try to protect? What would it specifically try to deliver? And after a fair bit of deliberation, I decided to propose that the legislation should protect all native species in Victoria, apart from human disease organisms. That was a political response to the likely reaction we get. But then the next question was, how rigorous should the protection be? And it was proposed. I proposed that all species that were covered by the Act should be guaranteed to survive and flourish in the wild. So a survival in a zoo was not good enough. The action machinery in the Act was then designed to make such an outcome possible. And the legislation, interestingly enough, with that framing, was actually adopted by the Victorian Parliament with the support of all the major political parties at the time in 1988. So just to rub it in, it meant that Labor was proposing it and the Liberal Party supported it, and the National Party didn't oppose it drastically. Years later, spurred by the huge melt of Arctic ice in 2007, David Spratt and I wrote Climate Code Red, the case for emergency action. Now, we knew that the state of the climate was a lot worse than people generally recognise, even back then. But once again, the issue of what was the protection focus that we were trying to draw attention to was raised. What should we protect? How rigorously should we protect it? The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was aimed to prevent social and ecological collapse. But it seemed to David and I that that was a pretty low bar. Like if that's really what we're working on, we've left things pretty late. So instead we proposed in the book that the goal should be the restoration of a safe climate to protect all people, to protect all species, and to protect all generations. So you had to have this really comprehensive view about what needed to be protected. Even in 2007, 2008, as we worked on Climate Code Red, it was clear that the Earth was dangerously too hot already. I mean, that's why the Arctic ice was melting. And so the restoration goal to protect all people, all species, all generations was going to require an industrial restructuring of a huge scale to transform to zero emissions, so we didn't make the problem worse. But that was not going to be enough. If the world was already in dangerous conditions, that meant there was too much carbon dioxide already in the air and that had to be taken out. And if it was already too hot, that meant that the world needed to be cooled down. Now, David and I looked around for past human experience that would give us some insight into the challenges of economic change of such a huge scale and such incredible speed. And the only comparable endeavour at that time that we could point to was the industrial mobilisation of the Second World War. I know that Seth's going to be talking about that, so I just wanted to raise one particular issue in relation to the war experience. In the years since the publication of Code Red, I've now consumed a very large library of books on the management of these economic mobilisations in the Second World War. And in the course of that reading, I discovered, once again, the importance of being very clear about what the protection focus is. So in the lead up to the Second World War, and particularly in the context of the American lead up to it, the prevailing US doctrine was hemispheric defence. Now, what that meant was that the US would defend itself, its sphere of influence, Canada, Mesoamerica, South America, but otherwise it wouldn't try to impose its will on the rest of the world. Now, some people might think that that probably seemed like a desirable, if partial, restraint, but the contours of the World War II, as they became clearer, meant that what would happen if the Americans followed this approach is that Europe and Russia and Africa would be belonging to the Nazis and their fascist allies. And Asia and the Pacific would be controlled by Imperial Japan. So in the end, Roosevelt insisted that the US military change its doctrine to ensuring unconditional surrender by the Axis powers. So what I'm really getting at is that you can see that the choice of goal, the choice of objective, created two entirely different possibilities of what the world could be like in however many years it took to resolve that conflict. And I think, I mean, we obviously are the beneficiaries in many ways of the Nazis not gaining power and the Imperial Japanese war machine not taking control of Asia, etc. So then, where to next? As well as reading about the management of war economic mobilisations, I started to bone up on the history of industrial safety. Now, you might wonder why that came about, but this was prompted by a conversation that I had with Joe Herbertson, who used to head BHP, which is a large mining company in Australia. It's Central Research Labs. And in 2010, Joe and I were working on a climate solution strategy for Safe Climate Australia. And on one occasion, we were discussing the problems of government policy. And Joe said that the inadequacy of the planned responses was so terrible that if people had acted that way, applied the same policies to industrial safety in the big mining companies and chemical companies that he was familiar with, they would have been sacked. Now, that might be very surprising to us because, I mean, we don't normally think of mining companies and chemical companies as, you know, environmental leaders. But in this case, it wasn't environmental in their terms. It was worker safety that they were concerned about. So that then raised the question, well, what might we learn from the whole industrial safety movement? What's interesting about that, it was a slow burn, 250 years of gradually improving approach to safety. But over those 250 years, 4 major changes occurred, which are really crucial. They went from employee responsibility, the workers who had accidents, it was their damn fault, they were too stupid. It shifted to say, no, management was responsible. They create the context in which workers operate, and they have to create safe working conditions. The second change was it went from post-accident coping, mopping up, whatever, to prevention. Then the third was it went from non-systematic management to whole system management. And finally, from risk reduction to risk elimination. That was the idea of having 0 accidents became a real thing and was adopted by companies like DuPont in a non-greenwashing way. Now, there are clear implications of these 4 changes to how we handle COVID, how we handle climate emergencies, but I'll come to them shortly. Now, recent occupational health and safety law and supply chain impact management adds a further critical principle, which I think, in fact, is absolutely vital to what we do on climate. And that's the notion of a chain of custody. So, for example, under Occ health and safety laws, the employer is responsible for ensuring safe working conditions for employees. If an accident occurs and then that's taken to court, a forensic examination takes place to see whether the employer can demonstrate the operation of an effective chain of custody. Now, what that means is, were they aware of their legal responsibilities? Did they have effective systems in place, staff and budgets, to ensure effective actions were taken that would translate from intent to actual effective action? If you couldn't demonstrate that chain of custody of responsibility flowing through from rhetoric to reality, then you are likely to lose your court case and the employer would be in deep trouble. Government action on climate, and I have to say, most climate movement advocacy catastrophically fails on the chain of custody test. Everything we say we care about, Pacific Islanders, coral reefs, the people of the third world, these all need a cooler Earth fast. But there is little advocacy for such a goal, and there is no government action at present to deliver it. Now, to try to trigger action to bridge the huge chasm between what we say we care about and what we actually call for in terms of policy, it requires a change of approach. So Adam Cardellini and I wrote a paper which was released just before the Climate Emergency Summit last year. That paper added one more element which has not come up in the historical review, but I think is also crucial, and that is that all of us talk a lot about how it's science that tells us what to do. But if you actually peel back, you find that science doesn't actually tell us what we ought to do about anything. What it does is it tells us how the world does work or could work under different circumstances. If we are to work out what our objectives should be, then what we have to do is go back to compassion, ethics, and even self-interest. Those are the three things that drive people to make decisions about which way to jump. The science then equips you to do whatever you've chosen to do more effectively than you would otherwise do it. So, okay, with these historical insights in mind, we can now learn something about how the COVID emergency has progressed, and then that opens up some questions for climate action. So, question one, who or what is to be protected and why? Now, it turns out that that question was critical to the COVID issue. In Australia, the focus started with preventing sickness and death in the community. But there was also concern for a key infrastructure to support that health program, and that was avoiding overloading the health system. But once the Australian policy evolved towards a low virus strategy, then the critical infrastructures that were most important became contact tracing and quarantining systems. And they were sort of infrastructure that had to be protected in order to protect health. Interestingly, Australia was also concerned about protecting the economy, as you'd imagine, but the Reserve Bank and our Federal Treasury made it clear that money could be printed to keep the economy afloat, and therefore it was possible to give greater weight to protecting health. And so that was an extraordinary thing, which turned Australia's government at the time had failed miserably on the bushfire challenge just weeks before. Well, in fact, it was still in the middle of dealing with hopelessly with the bushfires when the COVID crisis emerged, and then a neoliberal government, in the space literally of about a month or a month and a half, ditched all that and adopted an entirely different process. The very same people. So I'll come back to how that might be possible, because it's absolutely crucial that we understand that. So countries like Taiwan, Vietnam, Mongolia, New Zealand had experience with earlier pandemics, as did Australia, and they were committed to providing high protection in the health area and also protecting their economies. Other countries like Singapore started out with the same aims, but the virus found gaps in their protection systems, and so they struggled for a period to regain control, but eventually did so, as we did in Victoria, the state of Victoria. But in some other countries, national leadership favoured protecting the economy or life as usual until the spread of the virus created a political crisis that demanded more emphasis on protecting health and health systems. So think Sweden, United Kingdom, Belarus, the list goes on. Some countries focused on protecting the political positioning of the national leader, think the United States, think Brazil, with terrible consequences for the people's health. Second question, how secure should that protection be? What was very interesting was that when the pandemic first started in Australia, it was not entirely clear how tight we were going to manage it. But what happened was the idea that we wanted to protect health still remained dominant. So what happened was when people discovered that the management systems were failing, were not adequate, were poorly administered, et cetera, like lots of problems, what happened was that people said, okay, we'll just have to fix it. And so on the fly, they worked on fixing it. In some other, so they lifted the protection standard was lifted because the aspiration was to provide high levels of health protection. In some other countries, protection measures were judged mainly by their political value, one way or the other, how it affected the politicians until the virus got wildly out of control. And so, for example, the US under Trump, it initially New York and other states of that sort led the charge, but eventually Trump decided to take a different approach. Next question. Who should be responsible for ensuring protection and who needs to have backup responsibility? Now, in the case of Australia, the federal government and the state governments shared the lead in different policy areas. But what's really interesting is that the states and territories played a very strong role in cementing the low virus strategy, which distinguished it from the United Kingdom and the Netherlands and a whole range of other countries and Sweden, etc. And so the states cemented that approach, which then led the federal government rather rapidly to then have to innovate in the economics area. And so they realised that they could use the printing power of the Reserve Bank, and they used that to underpin a raft of measures to protect the economy, given that there were these major lockdowns and changes to the way the economy was operating. Now, in a number of other countries, the national government leadership was completely hopeless. US, Brazil, Belarus, actually Belarus started to improve. But the interesting thing is that lower levels of government stepped in actively to protect people's health in many of these countries. And they did as well as they could in the very difficult circumstances. So it's quite surprising occasionally to see national leaderships that are completely hopeless, negligent, corrupt, whatever, and yet the countries manage at least some level of decent response. Fourth point, how will those responsible organise themselves to ensure protection? Now, in the case of the Australian situation, in the case of Australia, there was a quick evolution of the National Cabinet that brought the Australian government and the state and territory governments together to facilitate fast coordination. Now, I was interested to see that Stephen Duckett said that he thought that maybe the National Cabinet hadn't worked as effectively as the rest of the country thought. I'm not an expert on that, so I think that'll be an interesting question to look at. So finally, applying the lessons to the climate issue. The dynamics of case studies that I've conveyed vary according to the severity of the threat to the nation as a whole, the speed of the feedback loops. And so the slowest moving system is the industrial safety system, which we have 250 years of change in that area that we can review. The fastest moving systems were the world wars and the COVID pandemic. Now, what was interesting about COVID, for example, was that it moved so fast that basically all politicians knew that the human and economic impacts that occurred under their watch, and therefore the political consequences of what they did, would be felt by the next election. So in other words, there was this extraordinarily tight connection between what a government chose to do and their expectation of having to face the music for what they did. Now, that, of course, is very different from industrial health and safety on a long-term basis. It's also different from climate in a critical area. But what's interesting, though, is that this fast feedback loop is also quite similar to what happens in the Second and First World Wars. So what can we actually learn from these examples for our work on climate? Now, the talk that I'm giving is too brief to cover all the implications, so I'll just pick out a couple of the most important. When the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was negotiated in 1992, much less was known about climate change, the science of climate change, etc., solutions. And the serious impacts were thought to be a very long way off. And so committing to avoiding the collapse of ecosystems at some future date and avoiding the collapse of civilization seemed like a very strong goal. But now in 2021, we know that the climate heating has already wrought dangerous changes to the Earth's systems. In fact, going back for decades. In fact, in the case of the West Antarctic, it was already suffering severe, dangerous change back at before the UN Framework Convention was even inked at all. Now, what another implication of the slower moving nature of the climate issue is that we've got used to working on just our bit of the problem. So everybody around the world thinks it's a big issue, it's a hard thing to deal with, and so we'll just do our bit because it's too much to expect anybody to have their head around the whole lot. On the last page, Luke. So what's happened is that bad habits have become institutionalised, and our efforts are, in a sense, now rudderless in a real sense. What we're doing is we're going through the motions of trying to get to zero emissions without any idea of whether zero emissions is going to save the Pacific Islands or the coral reefs or save the people of Bangladesh or stop the Vietnamese losing a lot of their rice growing areas, and the list goes on and on and on and on. So what I think we need to do is, if we're going to have a reset on climate change, I think it's absolutely critical that we commit to maximum protection for the climate vulnerable, that is people and species, through fast temperature reductions and the restoration of a naturally safe climate. We need to create a chain of custody to link this new protection goal to effective action, so that we don't lose the connection between what we say we care about, what we say we're trying to protect, and what we actually do and what we actually advocate. The approach, I think, will lead to the need to do three things simultaneously. Switch to zero emissions at emergency speed in less than 10 years. Draw down all the excess carbon dioxide in the air in decades, not in centuries. And to develop, and if they can be applied with net environmental and social benefit, then apply fast cooling methods such as solar reflection or cirrus cloud thinning in years and not decades. Now, it may turn out that after the science is done, the goal is protection. If after you do the science you find that methods are not going to deliver net protection, then you don't use them. It's as simple as that. But if they can work, then you should consider the possibilities. A program like this will change the emotional intensity of our commitment to protection, because it'll tighten the link between what we say we care about and what we know we must do to protect them. And it will change the time dynamics, because we'll be starting to operate in programs that will deliver results and protections in years, not decades or centuries or thousands of years. And so this means that we'll be able, because the emotional intensity is stronger, even though the task is harder, more things to do, I think it'll actually be easier to do the work, because we'll be bringing more intensity to the task. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Philip. And now coming to you from Canada, where it is quite late in the evening, so thank you for staying up. We've got Seth Klein here with us, and Seth has served for 22 years as the founding British Columbia director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And this is an organisation that is committed to social, economic and environmental justice. Seth's also a founder and former co-chair of the British Columbia Poverty Reduction Coalition. He's also an author, and his most recent book is something that is really relevant to the conversation that we're having here tonight. It's called A Good War: Mobilising Canada for the Climate Emergency. Seth, thank you so much for staying up for us.
Well, good evening. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we've got you.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much for this invitation. I'm honored to be virtually with you. Where I am, it is indeed very late Wednesday evening still, just past midnight now. But I'm up for it if you're up for it. I am joining you with gratitude from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, otherwise known as Vancouver, Canada. And I've been asked to offer some opening comments, drawing on the book that you just mentioned that was published last September. This is the book, by the way. A Good War: Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. I hope and believe that my book calls on us to adopt an entirely new and different approach to the climate crisis than the one we've pursued to date. It is a very Canadian book, but I think with relevance to you folks. And while I've endeavored to tell the truth about the severity of the crisis we face, people are also finding it an unusually hopeful book. Its original twist is that, as the title suggests, and building on some of Philip's comments, the book is structured entirely around lessons from the Second World War. There's no small irony in me coming to this place, and like many of you, I'm sure, I wrestle with the war analogy. My own political activism started as a teenager in the peace and disarmament movement in the 1980s, but I am now strongly of the view that climate breakdown requires a new mindset to mobilize all of society, to galvanize our politics, and to fundamentally remake our economy. And here's why, just to give you some Canadian context, but the same applies to your country even more so. We need a new approach, because what we have been doing in response to the climate crisis thus far simply isn't working. If you were to look at Canada's greenhouse gas emissions going back the last 20 years, what you would see is basically a flat line. In your country, of course, the trend line is worse. So despite decades of calls to action, our emissions are not on a path to stave off a horrific future for our children and future generations. We have run out the clock with distracting debates about incremental changes, but where it matters most, actual GHG emissions, we've accomplished precious little. And so here we all are, confronting this harrowing gap between what the science says we must do and what our politics seems prepared to entertain. Now, I didn't actually start off planning to write a war story. My book project began as an exploration for how we can align our politics and economy with what the science says we must urgently do to address the climate emergency. It is that. But I had initially planned to include only a single chapter on lessons from the Second World War because, like Philip was alluding to, I'd long been intrigued by World War II as an example of rapid economic transformation. But as I delved into that work, I began to see more and more parallels between our wartime experience of mobilization and the current crisis. And I ultimately decided to structure the entire book around lessons from Canada's World War II experience. I see in the history of our wartime experience, and I suspect that of Australia as well, a helpful and indeed hopeful reminder that we have done this before. We have mobilized in common cause across society to confront an existential threat. And in doing so, we've retooled our entire economy twice, in fact, once to ramp up military production, another time to reconvert back to peacetime, all in the space of a few short years. Now, let me speak about the lessons I see from this pandemic experience. First off, appreciate how awkward the timing of my book was. I wrote the book before the pandemic. I thought we needed an historic reminder of how quickly we have transformed society and our economies in the past. I shipped the book off for final copy edit 3 days before the first lockdown. And then, lo and behold, here we all are, living the change in real time. A challenge, of course, is that the pandemic has, for the last year, pushed the climate emergency off the front burner. And that's unfortunate because prior to the pandemic, I think we'll all remember, the climate mobilization was actually starting to gain some real momentum, thanks especially to the youth-led global climate strikes, as well as to extreme weather events, as you folks know all too well. But the pandemic has also taught us some important and valuable lessons upon which we now need to seize. The similarities abound between wartime emergency experience and the current pandemic response. In both cases, things that seemed politically and economically off limits become newly possible. Philip just spoke to that as well. In contrast to our government's hollow proclamations on climate, we now have been forcefully shown, this is what emergency looks and feels like. The status quo is suspended. Government leaders and public officials hold daily emergency briefings. Government cabinets form emergency committees of key ministers like they did in the war. Resources and personnel are redeployed. Manufacturing capacity is requisitioned to produce essential products. Governments assume power to redirect necessary supply chains. Public facilities are repurposed as needed, and we honor those on the front line. The news media, and Stephen spoke to this, the news media and journalists have risen to the occasion, quickly retooling their kitchen tables in the early days so that they could continue to provide vital public information and rally our collective morale from their homes. And in this welcome shift from what has marked climate reporting, in this pandemic crisis, the media, for the most part, seem to feel no obligation to give credence and space to those who question the scientific evidence. We have also come to understand that the vulnerable must be urgently looked after, or we are all more vulnerable to this invisible foe. The emergency response to protect the most vulnerable has, of course, been far from perfect. The pandemic has revealed and exacerbated all the existing inequities in our society, but now at least we seem prepared to recognize and begin to repair those interlocking fissures. Just as social solidarity was vital to wartime mobilization of World War II, so it has been in this crisis. And for the most part, some of our displays of that solidarity have been beautiful. It's true, of course, just like in the war, there's a minority of people who respond in selfish or antisocial ways, but These have been the exception. The large majority of us have shown our best selves. We've heeded the instructions of public health officials, organized mutual aid networks, looked out for our housebound neighbors. We've stayed calm and entertained our children. We have cooperated. And crucially, and Philip was speaking to this as well, as in times of war, our governments at every level have appropriately dispensed with the fetishization of balanced budgets and are spending what is required, and deficits be damned. The extraordinary public spending now underway in response to the pandemic merely shows what we could have done in response to the climate emergency or poverty or homelessness all along. It turns out when our governments recognize an emergency, the money was always there. The curse of the climate crisis, it turns out, is that in comparison to the pandemic and the war, it moves in slow motion. And it's allowed politicians to kick the can down the road. The COVID pandemic has reaffirmed the role and value of ambitious government action. Social solidarity and support for public services is likely at a generational high. There's a new spirit of national and cross-partisan cooperation in our lands upon which we must capitalize. The public is going to emerge from the COVID crisis with new respect for scientists and scientific evidence. We collectively now understand that the more our economy is localized, the more resilient we are to disruptions. And the economic recovery urgently requires public investment. You combine all of these realities, friends, and they provide key ingredients for the climate emergency mobilization that must now get underway. And after 40 years of a neoliberal agenda that has, I think, as its most insidious legacy, the sapping of our sense of possibility and our collective faith and our capacity to undertake great tasks together, the pandemic has shown us how quickly we can change our ways and how swiftly we can throw out the rule book. In some important ways, our sense of imagination is restored. Ever since I released my book in September, and there's been great response to it in Canada and done lots of media, and invariably I get asked in interviews, how do you know when a government gets the emergency? And so reflecting on the war and the pandemic and the climate crisis, I've been forced to distill a 400-page book into what I now call my 4 markers of when you know that a government has shifted into emergency mode. So here are my 4 markers. Number 1, it spends what it takes to win. Number 2, it creates new economic institutions to get the job done. Number 3, it shifts from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures. And number 4, it tells the truth about the severity of the crisis and communicates a sense of urgency about the measures necessary to combat it. During the Second World War, the Canadian government did all of those things, and I suspect yours did too. Likewise, in response to the pandemic, albeit imperfectly, our governments have passed all 4 markers. But with respect to the climate emergency, thus far at least, our governments are failing on all 4 counts. Let me just say a little bit more about these 4 markers. Marker number 1, spend what it takes to win. A benefit of an emergency mentality is that it forces governments out of an austerity mindset and liberates the public purse. This year, in response to the COVID emergency, Canada's debt to GDP ratio is going to rise from about 30% to 50%, a big jump in a single year. But at the end of the Second World War, it was more than double that. And when C.D. Howe, who was the Canadian minister who oversaw our country's wartime military production, was pressed about wartime spending, he famously replied, "If we lose the war, nothing will matter." However, our spending on climate action and green infrastructure pales in comparison to both the war and the pandemic response. Canada's Trudeau government isn't merely spending a little less than it should in the face of the climate emergency. They are spending less by a massive order of magnitude. Currently, my federal government is spending about $5 billion a year on climate actions and infrastructure. But in the pandemic, our central bank has been financing government spending by purchasing government securities to the tune of $5 billion a week. That is a contrast. Marker number 2, create the economic institutions needed to get the job done. During the Second World War, starting from a base of virtually nothing, the Canadian economy and its labor force pumped out a volume of military equipment, planes, vehicles, ships, armaments at a speed and scale that was simply mind-blowing. And remarkably, the Canadian government, under the leadership of this guy, C.D. Howe, established 28 crown corporations to meet the munitions requirements of the war effort. Howe was seized with the task. He was no lefty. He was happy to give contracts to the private sector, but he was in a hurry. And anytime the private sector couldn't quickly do what needed doing, he created another crown enterprise. Similarly, during the pandemic, we have witnessed, and this has already been spoken of, our government's creating audacious new economic programs, emergency response benefits and wage subsidies with a speed few of us would have predicted. But in response to the climate emergency, we've seen nothing of the sort. If our governments really saw the climate emergency as an emergency, it would, like C.D. Howe did, quickly conduct an inventory of our conversion needs to determine how many heat pumps, solar arrays, wind farms, electric buses we're going to need to electrify virtually everything and end our reliance on fossil fuels. And then it would establish a new generation of public corporations to ensure those items are manufactured and deployed at the requisite scale. Marker number 3, shift from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures. As I explained earlier, for the last 20 years, our GHG emissions have failed to bend the curve. Why? A major reason is that the actions we've taken to date have been almost entirely voluntary. We encourage change, we incentivize change, we offer rebates, we send price signals. What we have decidedly not done is require change. If we're going to meet the GHG targets that we now need to meet, we need to set clear near-term dates by which certain things will be required. For example, we would declare that it will no longer be legal to sell or purchase new fossil fuel burning vehicles as of 2025. We would mandate that all new buildings will not be permitted to use natural gas or other fossil fuels for heating as of next year. We would ban the advertising of fossil fuel vehicles in gas stations. That's how we make clear that this is serious. And the final marker, number 4, tell the truth and rally the public at every turn. Many assume that at the outbreak of the Second World War, everyone understood the threat and was ready to rally. And that's not true. It's not true in my country. It wasn't true in your country. It certainly wasn't true in the United States. It took leadership to mobilize the public. In frequency and in tone, in words and in action, the climate mobilization needs to look and sound and feel like an emergency. The leaders that we most remember from the Second World War were outstanding communicators who walked this careful line. They were forthright with the public about the gravity of the crisis and yet still managed to impart hope. Their messages were amplified by a news media that knew what side of history they wanted to be on, and by an arts and entertainment sector that was keen to rally the public. Similarly, that's how our governments have modeled emergency communication in the pandemic. The messages are ubiquitous. We receive daily press briefings. We hear regularly from public health officials. Government leaders in the media have listened to science and health experts and acted accordingly. None of this consistency and coherence, however, is present with respect to the climate emergency. When our governments do not act as if the situation is an emergency, or worse, when they send contradictory messages by approving new fossil fuel infrastructure, they are effectively communicating to the public that it's not an emergency. If our current leaders believe we face a climate emergency, then they need to speak and act like it's a damn emergency, because that's what you do in a crisis. And let me just offer this as a concluding thought. Just as the Second World War ended the Great Depression, as we rebuild from this pandemic, an ambitious climate plan with massive green infrastructure spending, a Green New Deal, can be just what the doctor ordered. The vital and urgent challenge now is to ensure that we use this experience and the opening it creates to catapult our societies into that post-carbon economy. As Arundhati Roy urges, this pandemic, like past ones, should be seen as a portal, a gateway between one world and the next, so that we don't return to yesterday's normal with all of its inequalities and fossil fuel reliance. A final notable difference between the pandemic and the climate crossroads moment is this. People talk about COVID fatigue, and that's real. Some have responded to my thesis by saying, look how quickly we tired of emergency in this pandemic in less than 1 year. And now you're asking that we spend multiple years in emergency mode to tackle the climate crisis. But here's the distinction. The things that we were called upon to do in response to the pandemic are anathema to all of our social instincts. We're told to isolate, to stay home, and that's hard. The good news about the climate mobilization is that it calls on us to do precisely the opposite, to get out there and do something grand together. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much for that, Seth. It's always nice to hear a bit of inspiration and hope as well in all of this. Now, just a reminder again, because of the way that we're doing this tonight, we're going to be taking your questions. We've already got a bunch that have come in, but you can send some more through on slido.com and use the hashtag reset21. Again, you can also upvote questions or ask your own. Now, we're going to have a few conversations. Hopefully, have an open discussion. I know it can be a bit awkward sometimes on Zoom, but feel free to jump in whenever. One thing that struck me it came up quite early, but I've been thinking about it. Stephen Duckett said when he was talking about Australia's response to COVID, you mentioned that the people moved before the government, and it was really people socially distancing, people doing all the right thing. I'm just wondering why you thought that happened and what it was. Was it in terms of education or awareness, or why we saw people moving before governments? And what was the trigger that you saw that made governments respond? Because I think there is a lot of parallels there with the climate movement, because I think people are really, they're wanting to move really before the government.
Thanks very much for that. So this is speculation. This is just my guess. So if you hark back to February, March, you will remember the pictures and the stories about Italy. I don't think seeing the empty streets of Wuhan was significant. But what I think we saw and heard those stories about Italy, a country like us, where huge death rates, harrowing stories about people giving up beds in ICU, not knowing, the health system was completely overwhelmed, didn't know how to treat this. Then we saw the empty streets. Then we saw the stories about the opera in the streets and so on and so forth. So that seared itself into the public's mind that COVID was serious, it killed people, and there was something you can do about it, namely stop the spread through a lockdown, and that people were fearful about it. One of my colleagues at Grattan came to me, and so we had a debate at Grattan where I work about what we're going to do, and he said he wants to work from home from now on because he has an immunocompromised system. So he was fearful. And so Grattan actually closed down before, and everybody worked from home before the government required us to. And so I think what we saw was the public saw, first of all, this was serious and it could impact on us. I think if I then switch over to climate change, there are lots of people in rural Australia who saw the impact of the bushfires, who saw the impact of floods. The question then is, can we get them to realise that the evidence is that these extreme events are going to be more frequent and more serious because of climate change than they have been before? So it's linking the consequences to the cause, which was pretty obvious and transparent and direct. You can see it in the case of COVID. It is the same in the case of climate change, but there is a whole lot of deniers who are trying to say that that is not the case.
Yeah, great. Okay, we've got it all coming up here as well. Now, Sasonka, we had a question that's come in for you from Slido already, and it was around what you were talking about the huge public movement in South Africa, and really you're talking about like the rallies in the streets. And someone's asked, with COVID restricting the ability for large public gatherings, how do we rethink public climate change protests and public climate change action for the next year?
Thanks. I think that's a really important question. In some ways, some time ago, I think in certain countries, we have witnessed what I call, and I've heard people loosely call, the death of the street, the sense that the street no longer has the ability to shame politicians, certain types of politicians. And we saw this in the first round of Black Lives Matter protests, in the US, that rising, that presence on the street didn't necessarily translate into any kind of policy action in a way that those numbers of people taking to the streets would have done, I think, in a previous era. So I think if we think about this idea of the death of the street and think about the new ways in which people mobilize, particularly online, and if we marry that with the extent to which, QAnon and conspiracy theorists and all of this new mobilization also seems to take place online, you have to think about how virtual tactics work. So I don't have a complete response, but I think that more than I would have said, 5 years ago, the online space matters. I think pressure on politicians matters. And I think the news media, as a few people have noted, plays an absolutely crucial role now. In the last, 24 hours, we've witnessed what it means when someone spouts conspiracy theories about COVID and is badgered and shut down very quickly. The tolerance level for that in Australia has been extremely low because the consequence is that people die, right? And it would have been amazing to watch that same level of tolerance applied to all these bizarre sort of, there's both sides kind of stuff that we've seen for years and years in terms of the way the media covers, climate issues, that, well, there's some people who believe this and there's other people who believe that, as though there is, in fact, some kind of debate about climate science. So I think the combination of the news media and recognizing the increasing importance of mobilizing online, and I would add to that, not just pressure on politicians, but pressure on the private sector, until we can get those mandatory regulations and laws that Seth has spoken about so eloquently. In the meantime, governments follow people. And what will have to happen is that people will force companies to shift the way they operate. So I think it's a variety of ways, but online becomes much more important.
And on that as well, Seth, in terms of when you were speaking about, actually a few people spoke about, like you said, wartime mobilization and this idea of, I guess, that threat and that level of urgency. But with climate change, it's such a, it's not going to be, it's kind of like a longer time frame that we're talking about. I'm just wondering how you think, Seth, that we convey the same sense of urgency with climate change, but over a much longer period. And also, like you said, when there is potentially going to be fatigue of that mentality after we come out of the COVID pandemic. You're on mute, sorry. And you was going to say that at least once, so there we go.
Yeah, I can't believe it happened to me. I was the one who brought out the motto of 2021. So one of the things that I actually take some solace from in the World War II story is that, people assume that the moment, war was declared, everyone understood the threat to be clear and present. And they didn't. If you lived in Europe, it was clear and present. But if you lived in Australia or Canada or the US, it was not clear and present. It was on the other side of two oceans. And so, whether it's that or the pandemic, I find myself noodling over what is that alchemy, that combination of events and leadership that shifts the zeitgeist and suddenly results in a public getting the emergency. And all crises and emergencies begin with a period of denial. We all lived through it at the pandemic, right? We all spent the early weeks or months hearing the early news stories, but not there yet, not realizing what this was actually going to mean. And we can all probably remember when it started to shift, right? For a lot of people, I don't know, in North America, for a lot of people, it was the cancellation of the NBA basketball season. Now, I don't even watch basketball, but I remember that thinking, wow, this is serious. But I know it also took watching my prime minister give news conferences every morning outside his home while he was in his own lockdown. That starts to convey emergency. In the war, You know, for a lot of people, it was the fall of France when 9 months into it, suddenly people are like, oh my goodness, this is serious. And there's some remarkable stories about how, you know, Sasanka was talking about the role of media. In the case of the US, who took 2 years before they entered World War II, a lot of people point to the role of the CBS News team and giving them credit for a 20 percentage point shift in US public opinion between the beginning of the war and Pearl Harbor, where the majority of US public opinion shifted from not joining the war to joining because of the storytelling that happened. So in the present, I think some of this, one of the things I recommend is, so the events and leadership. The events are, of course, the extreme weather events, as you've all lived through. And I think we should start calling them attacks on our soil. These are attacks on our soil. And the good news is, at least in the Canadian polling, I can't speak to it in Australia, there has been a real shift in public opinion over the last 3 years, where people's understanding of the climate threat has shifted from being a threat somewhere in the future, somewhere else, to here and now, and where they identify that people they know, if not themselves, have started to experience the impacts of climate change. And the result of that is a public that is actually ahead of our politics in terms of their preparedness to accept bold policies.
Thanks. And we've got a question for Philip as well. Philip, I think someone took issue a little bit with something you said. We've got a question that says, you said there's very little advocacy for rapid climate change action, but aren't many of us pushing as hard as we can? What forms of action are you talking about?
Yes, look, the problem, if anybody watched the discussion on Tuesday, you'll know that the problem we have at the moment is that for the next 20 years, because of some fairly complicated, well, sort of moderately complicated climate science, the heating, if all we do is some version of reducing emissions or even eliminating them, for 20 years, the temperatures will not go down. They won't even stop going up. And anyway, I won't. Okay, the reason is because what happens is when we clean up the air of dirty CO2 producing coal-fired power stations, they produce another form of pollution as well, which is aerosols. And so the long-term effect, the bigger effect, is heating over the long term. The short-term effect is heating and cooling. And when you shut down the coal-fired power stations, as we must, what happens is you take away their cooling effect as well as their heating effect. Well, sorry, you take away their cooling effect straight away. And the heating effect, they've been pumping out CO2 that's accumulating in the air. COVID doesn't accumulate. CO2 does. That's the crucial scientific difference between the behaviour of the climate issue and the COVID issue. So anyway, the point is, for the next 20 years, unless we do something in addition to shutting down the emissions process, which we absolutely must do, and with extreme speed, unless we add drawdown, taking the excess carbon dioxide out of the air, and unless we rapidly develop safe and effective methods for short-term cooling, which could operate within the space of a couple of years if we can find safe ways of doing it. No guarantees on that, but if we can find them, you could get cooling which could do something about bushfires and coral bleachings and damage to agriculture and so on within the space literally of a couple of years. But that's not being worked on, and that's what I'm saying is missing.
And yeah, we've still got some questions coming in. I think I could ask this to anyone, but the question came to Sasanka. The question is, do we need to reframe? And this is a question, if you all want to jump in, please do. But the question is, does the climate crisis need to be framed as a public health response and as a public health risk, in order to gain the same attention as AIDS and COVID? And I guess by making it a public health response, it really brings it back to kind of that individual threat to individual people, parents, families, that kind of thing. Do you think we need to be talking about it more as a public health risk?
Not necessarily, because I think, one of the problems with human beings is that we are overly important to ourselves. And I think we wouldn't be in this situation if we weren't like that. So I'm wary at a philosophical level about doing that. But I want to just pick up on this last point that Philip was making, because I think the way that he responded to it is, I think, emblematic of what we need to do that answers this question about whether we talk about it as public health or not. So the bigger issue is that any of us, on this forum here can quickly point out and debunk the whole idea that, hydrochloroquine or whatever it was, causes, has some role to play in addressing COVID. Like, all of us can do that very quickly. Because what has happened in the last year is that we have democratized the science around COVID, right? So we don't all know every single detail about the science of COVID, but we have a high degree of literacy around it because it affects us and because we have made it our business to know. We have insisted that politicians, brief us every day, all of that stuff, because it is an existential problem. And I think that what will help us to frame the conversation around the climate emergency is a sense of many minds trying to solve the problem together in a way that is genuinely organic, public, and grassroots, so that I am not wondering about the science of emissions and what cooling is and right? That is absolutely crucial. And I am both petrified and mobilized to figure that out based on what Philip has just said, right? That is like so important, but it is crucial that everybody understands at a level of nuance that I think we don't currently have, because that's what gets the urgency. That's what leads us to the sense that we need to be moving, I think, as everyone on this panel has said so eloquently, in years, not decades, that we are talking about not voluntary anymore, but absolutely mandatory, that happens on the basis of a public that is able to engage, push back, ask questions, and most importantly, frame the issues as public health, as about racial justice. For me, when I began to realize that this, and it was late in the game, but when I began to realize that this has a very real consequence for Black people's lives, was when Cape Town was about to get to day 0 of no water. That's not, we're not playing around anymore. That is my country. That is me, going to Cape Town and not actually being sure where will I stay and what will the situation be. So I think being able to frame it with many of our intelligent, wonderful minds in ways that democratize the conversation. It's certainly the way we did it with HIV. We had street activists. We had people who we called street doctors, who could tell you up and down the science of what that virus does when it is in your blood. And I think that's the level of granular detail that everybody needs to have in order for us to frame it in ways that make sense to different constituents, to politicians, et cetera, et cetera. Sorry for that long response.
No, that's a great response. It was actually something I was going to ask you as well, because with inequality, I think, is something that we've seen with COVID, with the AIDS epidemic, and it will be with climate change as well. I guess it amplifies a lot of inequalities, these pandemics. And I feel like you were saying, then there's an opportunity to do things better so we don't make those same mistakes. But we do really need to center climate justice and these kind of questions about, like you said, poverty and racial inequality, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I think, part of what happens when you have broad coalitions of people working on things is that they help you to think more deeply and to act in far more sustainable and long-term ways that reach all the communities that you need to reach in the ways that need to be reached. So the thinking, the thinking has to be done collectively. That's all I can say. And I think, we all know that this, just like COVID, climate questions really follow the lines of existing inequalities.
And Stephen, I think you were trying to jump in there as well, and I jumped over the top of you, which is also very 2021.
Thanks. In answer to the question about framing as a health issue, I think the answer is yes, and that is, we should not only frame as one issue. We've got to frame it as an economic issue. We've got to frame it as a health issue, and we've got to frame it as an Indigenous issue. But it's not just one issue, and different audiences will respond to different framing.
Yep, Philip.
On the question about the health response, what will happen at the moment, and this is already happening. So I'm involved with a network working group in the Australian climate movement, and people who are interested in the short-term impacts of climate change meet every fortnight to exchange views or whatever, or say what they're doing about their activities. And what I've really been struck by is almost everybody is now focused on, well, they're very strongly reorientated towards adaptation, because the problem is we have floods, and what can you do about the flood when it's happening? We have fires. What can you do about the fires when they're happening? How do you show solidarity? You do adaptation. You go and help rescue people in the moment. And so the whole notion of how you'd stop this juggernaut is actually slipping off our agenda. And so, and particularly because the science means that we won't, if we only do zero emissions, I mean, if we got to zero emissions immediately, it'd be a huge thing, it'd be a fantastic thing, something that, you know, I and others have been working on for a couple of, you know, for a decade or so. But if that's all we do, we won't see any improvement in the incidence of floods, fires, famines, droughts. All the extreme weather events will go on for the next 20 years worse than they are now, because we're not actually bringing the stuff in that would actually turn that around in less than 20 years. And so the problem for us is how on earth do we encourage people to be activists if they see no results for 20 years, and the only thing they can do to save people who they care about, who they see suffering and whatever, is adaptation, which of course you have to do, but it's not enough.
And I'm Seth, because I'm a bit of a sucker for happy endings, and I liked that you did mention that there was a somewhat hopeful message in your book. I guess to summarize it, where we are at now in the world, we are hopelessly behind where we need to be, and everybody has acknowledged that in the talk. I think we all know that. But do you think that we will mobilise in time? Can you see that happening? Do you think we're going to mobilise and meet this emergency as needed?
I struggle with this question. Well, the short answer is we don't know. You know, that is the ambivalent time in which we live. We do not, you know, we're going to mobilize at some point. The question is, will we mobilize in time? And that is very much an open question. And we don't know if we're going to rise to the challenge and do what we have to do in time. But you asked for a hopeful ending. Let me try it. Let me offer this.
You don't have to fake it. It's okay.
No, well, I'll share with you where I landed in my own book, and it's this. It's useful to remember. You know, my book is all framed around this previous mobilization. I don't know the numbers for Australia. In Canada, we were only a population of 11 million people at the time, and over 1 million people enlisted. That is a remarkable figure, isn't it? But here's the thing that they didn't know. They didn't know if they would win, right? We forget that. We forget because we know how the story ended, but they didn't. And they did what they had to do anyway and surprised themselves in the course of it. So that's the spirit we need to do this in.
Thank you. That's a really good note to leave it on, because unfortunately that is all the time we have for tonight. We're going to have to wrap it up. I really want to thank all the speakers that we've got here. Thank you so much for making yourselves available tonight. I'm sorry we couldn't do it all in person, but you know, it is 2021. I was going to say 2020, but it is 2021. So thank you to Stephen Duckett, Sasonke Msamang, Philip Sutton and Seth Klein. Thank you all so much. And the next Reset 21 Forum is going to be on next Tuesday, and the theme is Wreckage to Reform, Native Title Remake to Strengthen Climate Repair. So make sure you check that one as well. check that one out as well. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a really safe night, and thanks again.